Hi everyone. Thanks for attending this session today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Turrbal and Jagera people, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are in the room today, and also all people who are former refugees and in this room today. So I'm going to present some of my doctoral research findings, which I've just completed, and I'm going to focus particularly on presentations of trauma in early childhood from the perspectives of educators, and I'm going to also focus on trauma from the perspectives of parents trying to access early childhood services here in Queensland. And note that all names I use in the presentation are pseudonyms. So let me begin with a true story. Miriam, not her real name, sidled up to me before a focus group, and she repeated that what she said to me was, I had to withdraw my son from childcare because he wanted to kill himself. And I thought, that sounds surprising, a bit unusual for a 4-year-old boy to want to kill himself. And she said that childcare had made him upset and suicidal, and he was cutting himself. And I thought, again, quite unusual. But then Miriam told me that she had been in an Australian immigration detention centre for several months with her daughter Sarah, who was 9. And that was after she'd endured a very nasty sea journey and atrocities in her country of origin. So it wasn't surprising then that her son Beiruz, even though he hadn't been through that journey, was sitting beside her. He was clingy, he was non-verbal and he was anxious. On arrival, when Miriam and Sarah were processed in the immigration detention centre, she said that parenting her daughter was extremely hard under the conditions there. And then she said, and it's interesting because what she briefly told me was the same as what the Australian Human Rights Commission said in their report, i.e. that in that particular detention centre, like all the others, children were witnessing people who were cutting and burning and headbanging and setting themselves on fire. So the children were watching this and were quite distressed. So I couldn't help but think there was a connection between her very young son and what he was doing at his early childhood service. And also, I'm not surprised that children like Beiruz are presenting at early childhood services with trauma. So just quickly, refugees are people who are outside of their country of origin and unable to seek protection from or return to their country due to a well-founded fear of persecution based on racial, religious, ethnic or political discrimination. And asylum seekers are people who've sought protection as refugees, but their claims have not yet been assessed. And I'm going to use the word refugees to cover both in this presentation. So why is this research important? Well, what we know is that high quality early childhood education is extremely important. We know that the refugee experience is extremely traumatic. We know that more refugees are settling in Queensland than ever before, and we know that refugee families are missing out on kindergarten in Queensland. All of this is verifiable statistically, and exclusion decreases educational, health and employment opportunities across the lifespan. So my research emerged from a role I was engaged in. I was leading a program called the Embrace Culture in Kindy program for QCOS, and the purpose of that program was to increase kindergarten participation for children from diverse cultural backgrounds. And this was an initiative based on the National Partnership Agreement on universal access to early childhood education, decided on by COAG in 2008. And during my time running that program, I discovered that many refugee families had incredible barriers to accessing early childhood education, and their family support workers also had barriers and were telling me about those. So I realised there was definitely a gap, and I wanted to ask some questions and find out why. So my questions were, what are the barriers and enablers to access and participation in early childhood services for families with refugee experience living in Queensland? What strategies do early childhood practitioners implement to include children from refugee backgrounds? And how well do these strategies work to increase participation? So what I did was I interviewed, I conducted qualitative research to elicit the perspectives of people who knew what they were talking about. So for instance, I used purposive sampling strategies, and I interviewed 55 participants via semi-structured interviews and focus group. And of those 55, 38 had refugee or refugee-like experience, 52 were women, 26 were early childhood practitioners, and that was made up of bilingual support workers, family support workers, teacher directors, teacher educators and managers. And participants were recruited from 7 agencies, and those agencies were either receiving direct grants from or affiliated with a particular government-funded community-based initiative at the time. And all of the agencies were in southeast Queensland, Greater Brisbane area, Logan and Toowoomba and Lockyer Valley. And of the 38 participants with refugee or refugee-like experience, 25 people were born in Africa, from South Sudan, Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Nubia and Congo. And the other refugee participants were from Iran, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Turkey and Vietnam. So moving on to my findings, I categorised the barriers to access and participation into 5 domains. And these emerged directly from my data because I use constructivist grounded theory, which is it's a good method to use for social justice research because it's a combination of the participant, what the participant's telling you, and the researcher interpretation of that. And it's flexible, and so when you have some questions that arise from other questions, you can follow that lead. So the areas were poverty, language, culture, trauma and racism. And I'm going to unpack these a bit further for you. So the way of interpreting this data is to consider the influences upon a child from an ecological perspective by examining multiple cultural contexts in which we expect children to operate. These contexts are frequently oppositional and they're bound to collide, creating confusion and dissonance for a child and misunderstandings between parents and educators. And I found that the picture looked like this. So children who were living within a culture of poverty were generally had parents with infrequent, lowly paid casual work, or they were living on New Start allowance of approximately $250 a week. So those families were experiencing food insecurity. They were struggling to pay fees of between $25 and $85 a day for kindergarten programs, and they couldn't afford transport costs. And for those who did qualify for the Kindy Plus subsidy, even paying $5 a day was too much, especially if there were multiple children. So, and waiting list fees are just a way of saying refugees need not apply. So we know that poverty causes trauma. And then parents were finding it difficult to enrol because all of the enrolment paperwork was in English and not translated into community languages. And accredited interpreters were rarely utilised, and when they were, staff were not trained to use them. And I found that communication strategies included practices such as using family members, using young children as interpreters, or using, in the words of one participant, a game of charades by using hand gestures and facial expressions, which, as you could imagine, is not considered good practice by the National Accreditation Authority for Translators and Interpreters. And in addition, bilingualism, which we know from neurological research, is very important for young children to maintain appears to be actively discouraged almost universally in early childhood services across Queensland. And likewise, children's home cultures, including their religious affiliations, traditions, and their familial structures, are often at odds with their early childhood services, which tend to be Western in orientation and use a play-based curriculum. And although I'm a strong advocate for the play-based curriculum, it wasn't well understood by parents. And we know that not being able to communicate is another form of trauma. It creates more trauma. And then, okay, if early childhood education is not existent in a person's country of origin, or it's disrupted by a prolonged refugee experience, then knowledge of the complex Australian system is likely to be limited, requiring patient explanation on the part of an educator. So I want to talk about, well, for a start, so due to the uniqueness of the refugee experience, I found that young children often presented in early childhood services with various signs and symptoms of trauma. And I asked the 26 early childhood educators, practitioners who participated, to give me examples of children who were participating but had difficulty participating in kindergarten programs. And as you can see, the most commonly stated behaviours were related to aggression, violence and hyperactivity. And although most children from refugee backgrounds did not, behave aggressively, those who presented the biggest challenge, those who did presented the biggest challenge for educators. Hence they were mentioned more often. And in participant narratives about children behaving violently, children were not only dealing with past trauma, but many had to endure ongoing family violence as a result of a turbulent resettlement process. And typically children, and particularly young boys who'd experienced violence, had problems integrating into early childhood settings. They tended to bully other children, they tended to scare them away, and they posed a real threat to others, and they lacked playmates. And these children were frequently expelled from kindergarten. And other common behavioural presentations were shyness, withdrawal, separation anxiety, and signs of speech and language delay. And many children did not meet the developmental milestones expected of them within a Western context. For example, one 4-year-old child didn't climb stairs, and she was referred to medical specialists for all sorts of intervention. And then a bilingual cultural support worker was employed and found out that she lived in a refugee camp and simply couldn't climb stairs. And all it had to be done was to teach her to climb stairs. And also there were families who were conceived, with children conceived of rape, and incarcerated in Australian immigration detention centres, and there were complex signs of trauma and attachment issues for those children. And another problem mentioned was internet gaming addiction, with children as young as 2 attached to their iPads in lieu of parental attachment, which is another area worthy of further research. So as I appear to have a lot less time than I thought, I will just carry on with this bit. So there's a great deal of research evidence to suggest children who experience persecution are at higher risk of becoming perpetrators because their notions of good and bad are altered by violent exposure to violence and trauma. So when children are dealing with current beatings, they can't heal from their pre-migration trauma. And there's a link between exposure to violence and traumatic events in resettlement that precipitates a range of negative psychological outcomes for children. And chronic and inescapable violence can lead to the belief that revenge is the best way to obtain justice. Identification with the aggressor can occur as a way of countering their helplessness associated with being a victim. And this is a useful short-term strategy because it helps to regain a sense of control, but it can cause the child to be aggressive and antisocial at preschool and in the later years, unless more appropriate strategies are learned, because survival means looking after yourself first. Okay, so it's important that practitioners understand the reasons behind aggressive behavioural enactments, because if they don't, then research indicates that they'll be more likely to label children as oppositional, rebellious, unmotivated and antisocial, and this is research by Bessel van der Kolk. And educators may view children negatively and assume that they're not interested in learning, or they don't have the necessary skills to succeed. And that this leads on to relational disengagement and withdrawal of support. However, when educators in this research gained insight into the traumatic events encountered by children and understood how violence impacted upon their behaviour and upon their learning, the children were sometimes supported to stay in kindergarten instead of being excluded. So what I'm going to do is just, because I have a limited time, another issue was food-related, food deprivation trauma. So hoarding food, stealing food, and fighting for food and resources. So some of the strategies used by educators were actually keeping toys in the same place each week, or not using precious resources like water or macaroni in play, because these distress children. I have to move on with that. I believe that early childhood services, however, are well positioned to become culturally safe trauma recovery environments by alleviating poverty, by enabling language rights, by trauma-aware practice, and improving cultural credibility by increased educator training, specifically in trauma-aware practice, and in increasing cultural competence and cultural proficiency. And of course by anti-racism strategies and eliminating racism. So, whilst educators cannot fully erase the impact of trauma, it's possible to play an important role in fostering conditions known to promote children's happiness, successful adaptation and resilience. So I'd like to leave you with the question of how will you create a culturally safe trauma recovery environment?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and leaders past, present and future, and thank them for looking after the land that we now stand on. And I'd really like to thank Cherie for that really interesting presentation, and it's given me a really nice segue into some things that I'm going to be talking about then how do we introduce a trauma-informed response in early childhood, and how do we equip our educators to be able to work in these areas. So this is just a lovely little saying from Pam Leo, who's an independent scholar and human development researcher. She's developed an education program for parents called Meeting the Needs of Children. But this is so true. We either, if we work in early childhood, spend a lot of time dealing with the behaviours, or we can actually spend that time meeting their unmet needs. Either way, we're spending a lot of time, so let's get it right. Let's do the things that are good. So what is the evidence that we need to have a trauma-informed response? And I'm not going to read you all the statistics, this is just some of them. We know that, we also know that 1 in 4 children are presenting from a home that has some kind of physical violence. And these statistics, unfortunately, don't even include all the children that Cherie was just talking about from refugee camps and statuses. The Australian Institute of Health has actually published these statistics in 2018. But what we do know when we're working with these children is that early childhood settings are often our soft entry point for these children to come in. So often we don't know that if they've even been identified as vulnerable as yet, and it's only when we're making these relationships, developing relationships, that we begin to realise how vulnerable these children are, what complex trauma has gone on for them. If they've come to our services through a referral process, so there might be a care team and they might have already been sent to our services as a bit of a mitigation that, hoping that the early childhood service will help them hold the family together. What happens then is the family views us as the spy, the people who are actually going to be looking out on care and protection's behalf. It's up to us to really build a strong relationship with that family to avoid that and to be able to help them understand that actually what we want is really good outcomes for those children. So how do we get educators on board and how do we get everybody on board with that? So sometimes we need to look at things from a very different perspective. And what we need to do is change educators' patterns of thinking. And for those of you who've been here for the last 2 days, we've heard a lot about changing our language and about we're not going to say anymore about children what's wrong with you. We're going to go to that what's happened for you, what's happened that's led you to this behaviour that you're coming. So if we change that, in the very instance what's happened to educators is we've changed their perspective, we've changed their response, we've taken them from a place of judgment and we've brought them to a place of compassion and understanding for those children. So when we've done that, immediately the way they behave and respond is going to be quite different. So how are we doing that? So there's kind of 4 steps to this trauma-informed response, beginning with the enrolment process and the procedures and working with the care team, because the enrolment's going to be really important. Training for educators, which Cherie talked a lot about, because that is really going to form the basis and the underpinning knowledge for those educators. Individual learning plans for children, and then of course we're going to address the barriers and the challenges, and there is a lot of those, we know. So the enrolment and assessment procedures. Who should attend the enrolment process? Well, in a normal early education and care setting that's not with complex trauma, we ask the family to attend. Sometimes, however, what we would like, if we know that this is a child from complex trauma and a whole lot of things happening for them, we'd like everyone to attend. We'd like either, if they're not with their family and they're in a foster care system, or if there is therapists working with that family, it could be a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a counsellor, it could be behavioural therapy, it could be a social worker. What we want is we want that whole team to come, because early childhood settings can't do this in isolation. They have to have a multidisciplinary approach because they have to have the knowledge from everybody who's giving it in. So if there's a care team there, we want them present. We want them all to be able to give evidence. We want them to share their knowledge. We want to know as much as we can about that family. Once we've done that, how long should we allow for the enrolment process? This is really individual. What we shouldn't do is put a time limit on it. We need to allow the family, the caregivers, the foster carers, whoever it is that's with that child, and the educators and director, to really form a relationship, to have them come often and often and often, because at this time, in this enrolment period, is when we're going to form the knowledge that we need to do the individual learning plans that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So this is going to be an ongoing process, and it's going to be the basis of this relationship building. Then we're going to do the training for educators. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about trauma theory because you've just spent 2 days listening to it, and we all know about trauma theory, but what we know is that educators who work with children who have experienced complex trauma really need to understand the fight, flight, freeze response. They need to understand that these children are often working in their fear response. So their response is going to be aggressive. It is going to be short fuse. They're not going to have good self-regulation. If educators understand trauma theory, it will allow them to then change the way they work with these children. And if educators begin to understand... Oh, sorry, wrong way, never mind. If educators begin to understand the realisation that the fear response is where these children are living, they're going to have different programmings, different experiences for those children, and I'll talk a bit later, if I have time, about what that would look like. This is just showing the direct correlation for you between the brain development and pedagogy for early childhood educators. So we know that the brain develops sequentially, so depending on where the trauma has occurred for that child will depend upon where in their development it has affected it. So if we can marry those two together, we'll know that the experiences we're building, the responses we're having and the way the classroom looks will actually really affect the things that we do, so that we know that we want the child to feel safe. And if you were in Tom Brunzel's talk this morning, he talked a lot about that, the children feeling really safe when they come into the classroom. This is the kind of thing that we want to ensure. Then the movement, the emotional engagement, and then finally the learning. And if children are in their fear response, they're never in their cortex and they're never actually open to learning. So this is the stuff that we need to think about. So most educators already understand attachment, and understanding a good attachment theory helps us understand to know that that's for children where their internal template is formed. So a good attachment where they've had their needs met, they know that their world is safe and predictable. They're the children who think, I'm worthy, I'm lovable, I'm going to be okay, someone's going to look after my needs. Those children who have had significantly chaotic attachments or attachments where they've been neglected have actually developed a template about, I'm not worthy, I'm not lovable, and the world's really unsafe and I actually can't trust an adult. And as educators, when we understand that, it changes how we try to develop that relationship with a child. This attachment is also, as we heard Tom tell us earlier, is where we begin to build regulation, self-regulation and resilience. So in training for educators, we would add in the training about the psychoeducational resources. So this is an example of Dan Siegel's Flip the Lid, and we've talked about that a little bit today. So that's just one other resource that you might be able to use and help children understand that where they're sitting and if they're flipping their lid. There are lots of other psychoeducational resources that we use, and if you work in early childhood, we're actually already using them. We've just not really called them that. Social stories is one, where we help children to understand how their actions impact the world and the other children that they're working with. What it also does is it helps children to name big emotions. So we know that if they can understand their emotions, know where they're coming from, what place they are, that they're already going to be able to begin to understand how to control them and then what would do. So if we've got psychoeducational resources for children, that would include things like flashcards, helping them name emotions, those kind of things. Also in training for educators, we might include for them strategies that help children regulate emotions. So these are really important because these children actually don't know how to regulate their emotions. So children who are living in their fear response, their baseline for their hyperarousal is already much higher than other children. And what we want to help them do is to be able to come back down to a normal baseline. So we can use all kinds of different regulation ways to do that. I've got bubbles here because there isn't an early childhood setting in the world that doesn't use bubble blowing at some point. What's really important about these kind of strategies that we use is to have the underpinning knowledge of why we're using. Bubble blowing's great and we know that children love them, but actually from a trauma-informed response, what we know is that it teaches children to breathe deeply, and it teaches them to breathe right down into their belly and their diaphragm. And that actually has a physiological response and allows children to calm down. So we're not just using it as a fun activity, we're actually using it as a breathing activity. Blowing balloons. We might do things like music and rhythm. And this thing about the patterned responses that Tom talked about is really important, because what we want for children, I can quote Bruce Perry, he has told us that we need the 6 R's to be able to teach children to help self-regulate and rewire their brain. So we would use repetition, and we know that because that's how we develop mastery over our skills. We would use something that's rhythmic. So that's about having the rhythm about that it's got a pattern in it, because as humans, that's our brain, we're wired for patterns, we like that, so we want a pattern. Things with rhythms also bring us into the heartbeat, and that's the other reason that children find it calming. So we would want to do things like that. Therapeutic things like Play-Doh, clay, art, we use them because they're good for children, but also what they do is their therapeutic kneading is rhythmic, it gives them a sense of release. Art activities that have the big sweeping movements with the big paper, because they're the things actually that make children cross the midline. So that helps with that development of the left and right talking to each other, and that again is going to help with learning, and we know that. So the next thing I'm going to show you is about a classroom. How many here people actually work in early childhood? A few of you. Okay, lovely. This is just a fun little...
Doing with this.
Has anyone felt their day a bit like that? Some days. And I know when I was a director and I felt for educators who felt that their day was going like that. And then how do we do that? How do we de-escalate classrooms? What are the strategies that we use to help our educators be able to not have a classroom? That's a gross exaggeration. I'm sure classrooms don't really look like that, but when you're on the inside, sometimes they feel like that, don't they? So that's about those mirror neurons. That's about one of the most challenging situations for an educator is that a child who has difficulty regulating their emotions has the gift of upsetting the whole classroom unknowingly. So it just takes one child to be dysregulated and not very happy, that it passes on, and we have this domino effect, and our classrooms end up being a place where we just feel like we're doing crowd control and we're not doing any of those quality interactions that we really want to happen. So what we want to do is we want to give educators some strategies around that. And a lot of it we're already doing. It's music time, it's group time, it's rhythmic activities. But what we want to do in the day is do them far more often. We don't want to do them just as a transition to go to lunch in the middle of the day. We want to come in and do them a few times a day, 5 times a day, just for 10 minutes at a time, to bring children in together. So we want them to be able to learn to share, to learn to be together. So we want to do music activities where they have to take turns, but with rhythmic sticks, so they're getting the rhythm as well. Music activities or karate that allows them to do the midline, so a bit of, and I don't mean karate where they're going to karate chop each other, but things like Tai Chi, those calming ones. Also, things that draw them together, get children to trace around each other's hands and touch each other's hands and talk about how they're feeling with each other. Get them to draw around themselves on big pieces of paper and colour in how they're feeling. You'd be surprised what you can learn from a child when they're colouring in big black strokes in their belly because they're actually not feeling great. Get them to do this kind of thing. Use lots of flashcards with emotions on them, but do it as groups. The reason we want to do it often and not for prolonged periods once a day, but very often at little chunks, is because we want children to create mastery over these skills, and we know that practice and repetition is what gives children mastery, unlike myself who has not mastered walking yet. But yes, so we want them to create mastery, so we want to do it often and we want to do it in little bits. So through those kind of things, we want those to be included in our individual learning plans for children. Now, there's lots of debate whether we should always be doing them for all children. I certainly feel that we need to be doing them for children who come from complex trauma. They have got a multitude of needs that we need to work through. This is just an example. You don't need to use this, it's not perfect, but it's the kind of thing that if you've done a good enrolment process and you've been able to get lots of goals, this has just got one example of a goal, you can work through this as a team, and this is about this shared understanding and shared responsibility for these children also within your service. So if we wanted to develop self-regulation skills, one of the goals to address might be able to name an emotion, because we know if we name it, we tame it. We know that as soon as we're in our cortex thinking about it, we've already begun to be regulated. Flashcards with pictures of faces showing the different emotions might be one of the strategies that we're using. And who is going to be involved? The educators, the carers. This is going to be ongoing. And what's our measurement? What's our indicator that we've succeeded in this? That the child can begin to name their emotions correctly. Individual learning plans should be visited regularly because needs will change and children don't develop from here to here. They do this. So we know that there's going to be a lot of travelling in and out of that area. Are they doing well? For some reason they are, for some reason they're not. So let's revisit this really regularly so that we're keeping on board with what these children are needing. And finally, we're going to address the barriers and the challenges. So a major barrier in providing children with the required response and care needed for a trauma-informed response is a lack of communication. So my experience has been when we've had children from complex trauma in an early learning setting, it's been on an as-to-know basis, and we haven't actually been given the information we need as educators to be able to do our jobs properly. And we need to advocate to change that, hence the beginning of the enrolment strategy where people are coming together and sharing communication. Of course, one of the other things that is a big barrier is that educators get really burnt out. They find these behaviours challenging. We've not equipped them with how to deal with them, and we have this incredibly high turnover of educators. And how are we going to address that? Well, hopefully we're going to address that through the education that we're giving them and the skills and strategies we're giving them to be able to manage these kind of behaviours in the classroom. One of the other ways that we're going to address this with educators and that we're going to hopefully get them to stay is that we're going to give them really good, robust, reflective supervision. Not the kind of supervision where we address weaknesses, we give them tasks and we say this is where we want to see your improvement. It's about that really reflective, robust supervision where they can unpack their emotions, they can reflect on their responses to things, they can talk about what would have been a better response, and we can give them some key skills to be able to move forward in that. And it gives them a place to debrief. And of course, the other thing we know more than anything else is that encouraging educators to do self-care is really important. They've got to nourish to flourish. They need to be able to keep up their self-care. They need to have good exercise, good nutrition, good rest. And in a service, the leadership team can help them with this. They can invite people in to help them with wellbeing. But having good self-care is going to really hold them in a very strong place, in a robust place to be able to move forward with these children from complex needs. Thank you.